pointing this out. It's just, obviously, I'm viewing the situation from an outsider perspective looking in. So I guess take what I have to say with a grain of salt. One of my core foundational beliefs is that the primary moral imperative for humanity is to reduce needless suffering. In other words, the kind of suffering that serves absolutely no utilitarian purpose. And from my perspective, there is an absolutely staggering and disproportionate amount of needless suffering within the African American community right now, and in particular, the young black male demographic. But in order to identify the causes of that suffering and talk about ways in which we might reduce it, we have to be able to have an honest conversation. We have to be able to ask uncomfortable questions and speak uncomfortable truths. For example, when people say to me, Black Lives Matter, I wholeheartedly agree. But any serious conversation about the destruction of black lives would require that we ask and answer the question, who are taking the lives of young black men? And the answer, as it turns out, is overwhelmingly other young black men. So let's start with some raw data so you understand what I'm talking about here. African Americans are significantly more likely to die as a result of homicide than any other racial demographic in the country. In 2025, the black homicide victimization rate was 21 per 100,000, 7 times higher than for white victims at about 3 per 100,000. Also, and this is important, the overwhelming majority of homicide in the U.S. is intra-racial. In other words, people of a particular racial demographic killing other members of that same racial demographic. In single victim, single offender homicides where the race of both parties are known, around 80% of all white victims are killed by white offenders, and 90% of black victims are killed by black offenders. So right out of the gate, these numbers fly in the face of the idea that black on white crime or white on black crime are more common. And in fact, I think this is a narrative that is deliberately used by powerful people to spin up both white and black people and turn them against each other. When the reality is interracial crime is the exception to the rule, and intra-racial crime is much, much more common. There's also the issue of age stratification. For black males aged 15 to 44, homicide is the #1 cause of death and accounts for more than 40% of all deaths within that group. Compare this to black men over the age of 45, where homicide drops completely out of the top 10. And indeed, roughly 2/3 of younger black victims under the age of 21 are killed by members of the same age group. In other words, black teenagers predominantly killing other black teenagers. Now, the statistic that is very often thrown around is that African Americans, in spite of being only 13% of the population, commit more than half of all homicides, which is technically true, but it's actually way, way, way worse than that, because the black community is not a monolith, and the overwhelming majority of African American people never kill anybody, obviously. So it isn't the entire black community. It isn't 13% of the population. It is a very small subset of that demographic. When we stratify based on gender and eliminate females from our analysis, it makes a negligible difference. Black males make up just under 7% of the total population, but constitute 45 to 52% of known homicide offenders. And if you get even more granular and stratify by age, young black men aged 15 to 34, who make up about 3% of the total population, make up 40% of all homicide offenders in the U.S. So it isn't 13% of the population, it's 3% of the population, committing almost half of all homicides in the country, which is pretty fucking bad. Now, one of the more common responses that you'll hear when we talk about these rates of homicide is poverty, socioeconomic factors. And it's true that criminal activity tends to track with poverty rates regardless of race, but that isn't the whole picture. American Hispanics and Latinos, for example, have very comparable rates of poverty to African Americans within a few percentage points, but still only half the rate of homicide victimization. And American Indian populations have even higher rates of average poverty, but their rate of homicide victimization is 4 times lower than their African American counterparts. Also, it's important to keep in mind that 100 years ago, in 1940, the rate of estimated poverty within the African American community was nearly 90%. This percentage has steadily fallen over the years to just under 20% today. And yet, rates of homicide within the African American community remain multiple times higher than any other comparable demographic. And you might say, okay, well, there's also the issue of organized crime. Right? The prison industrial complex deliberately makes it much harder for people with felonies to find legitimate jobs on the real market, which makes them more likely to turn to things like robbery or drug trafficking in order to support themselves and their family. So maybe this accounts for the massive discrepancy in rates of homicide. But as it turns out, no, not predominantly. Around 75% of all Black homicide victims knew their killers personally, either as a friend, an acquaintance, a neighbor, or a coworker, which effectively rules out the idea that these killings are just the product of random criminal activity. And indeed, more than half of all Black homicide victims were killed as the result of interpersonal disagreement or conflict that escalated to the point of violence, and specifically not during the commission of another felony crime like drug trafficking or robbery. This interpersonal violence also manifests itself in the form of domestic abuse, which is why homicide is the number 2 cause of death for 15 to 34-year-old Black females. Hey, I got a question for you. Do you enjoy the videos that I make? Would you like to see this? No, it is explanations like poverty or being locked out of the job market or other various socioeconomic factors that are commonly pointed to as an explanation for this increased rate of homicide don't really add up by the numbers. Yes, it is absolutely true that African Americans have a long history of systemic oppression and segregation. But does that alone account for these staggeringly high rates of homicide? And more importantly, does it account for the fact that the homicide is overwhelmingly directed inward towards other members of the same community? Like, in spite of the ACAB talking points, these young men are not being killed predominantly by some external oppressor class or as a consequence of conflict with some other demographic. That would maybe make more sense. But again, no, they are overwhelmingly directing violence against members of their own racial demographic. For me personally, it is clear that there is some kind of destructive cultural component at play here that we just don't see in other demographics in the country. A self-destructive component that I believe is most obviously
What's up, Big Bear?
exemplified in the hip-hop industry. Now look, I enjoy exclusively 90s hip-hop just as much as the next white person, okay? But you don't need me to tell you that many genres of hip-hop, especially drill, trap, and gangster rap,